Imagine a major political party today, right? Any party.
Okay.
And imagine them voting unanimously. Like 100% of their members in Congress voting against a bill.
Unanimous fights are pretty rare, yeah.
Right. But now imagine that the bill isn't just, some minor tax provision or like a procedural technicality. It's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The literal bedrock of American civil rights.
Yeah.
The amendment granting citizenship and equal protection to millions of formerly enslaved people.
Yeah.
In 1868, that is exactly what happened.
It's a staggering reality to confront.
It really is, because the 14th Amendment, it passed with overwhelming 94% support from the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But when you look at the Democratic Party's voting record on that specific amendment, in both the House and the Senate,
Yeah.
the number of yay votes was exactly 0. Not a single one.
It's a historical reality that often just stops people in their tracks when they first hear it.
For sure.
Because we tend to view history through, the lens of our current political alignments, we kind of assume that the core identities of major parties have always been, well, somewhat static.
Right, like they've always stood for the same basic things.
Exactly. But when you look at a statistic like that 0% support for the 14th Amendment, it forces you to realize that political parties they're not immutable monoliths.
No, definitely not.
They are living, breathing, constantly mutating organizations. They respond to the sociology and economics of their eras.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today, for the learner joining us, we are taking a deep dive into an incredibly complex and honestly, often shocking historical narrative.
Very complex, yeah.
We're tracing the 2-century evolution of the Democratic Party. Because the question is, how does a political institution that originated with a fiercely pro-slavery platform, a party whose representatives literally led a massive congressional filibuster against civil rights, how does it fundamentally transform over generations into the party that ultimately championed the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Right. It is essentially a complete inversion of a political identity.
It really is.
It's arguably the most significant political realignment in American history. And to dissect exactly how this happened, step by step, we are drawing our insights from a very specific, thoroughly researched source text.
Right. What's the book called?
It's titled The Klan and the Elephant, Unraveling the Democratic Party's Ties to the Ku Klux Klan by Reverend Dr. Antonio Arnold. And to your point about the timeline, Reverend Arnold's book is meticulously structured to walk readers through this exact progression.
From the origins to the legacy. Now, real quick, before we get into the weeds of 19th century political machinery, I want to pause and make something unequivocally 100% clear to you listening right now.
Very important point to make here.
Yes. The source material we are diving into today contains highly politically charged, deeply sensitive, historical content. I mean, we are talking about the darkest, most violent chapters of American history.
Systemic racism, domestic terrorism, yeah.
Exactly. And because of that, we have to state our mission for this deep dive very clearly. We are absolutely not here to take sides. We are not endorsing any modern political viewpoints, whether they lean left-wing or right-wing.
We are strictly acting as impartial guides through the source material.
Right. We're just the messengers today. We are going to convey the historical events, the voting data, the visual campaign propaganda, and the specific arguments exactly as Reverend Arnold presents them.
The goal here is to help students, researchers, and anyone intensely curious about American history understand the actual mechanics of political evolution. How do coalitions form?
How do they break apart?
Right. How do parties rebrand themselves?
So to understand how this massive transformation happened, we can't just start in the 1960s.
No, definitely not.
We have to go all the way back to the foundation. And according to Reverend Arnold's text, to understand the pro-slavery origins of the party, you really have to look at the Anti-Federalists of 1787.
Yes, and this is the foundational key that unlocks the rest of the history. Following the American Revolution, there was this massive philosophical battle over what the new government should actually look like.
The Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists?
Exactly. You had the Federalists who wanted a strong, centralized national government, and then you had the Anti-Federalists led by figures like Thomas Jefferson, and they were deeply suspicious of a distant, centralized authority.
They didn't want another king, basically.
Right. They favored a very limited national government, which is why they fiercely championed the Bill of Rights to restrict federal power. They believed power should reside at the state and local levels.
So this eventually evolves into the Democratic-Republican Party in 1792, and then into the modern Democratic Party, which is officially founded around 1828 by Martin Van Buren, built to support Andrew Jackson.
Yes, that's the timeline.
And the text notes their ideology was deeply rooted in this agrarian vision and this concept of states' rights. But here's where I want to push back, or rather, where I need you to connect the dots for me.
Okay, sure.
Because today, when we hear states' rights or local control, it usually just means someone doesn't want the federal government, like dictating environmental regulations or education standards.
Right, contemporary issues.
Yeah, it's like a corporate franchise model. The local branch manager resents the corporate headquarters telling them how to run the store. But in the early 1800s, how did this Jeffersonian desire for local franchise control automatically prime the party to become the absolute defenders of human bondage?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the critical distinction. You have to look at what that local business model actually was in the American South.
Okay.
The agrarian vision championed by the early Democratic Party wasn't merely a romantic preference for farming over factory work. In the South, that agrarian economy was an entire socioeconomic system fundamentally dependent on enslaved labor.
I see.
So when the Democratic Party platform championed states' rights and fought against federal overreach, they were essentially providing the exact political architecture needed to protect the institution of slavery from any potential federal abolition efforts.
Wow, so it wasn't just a philosophical debate about the Constitution for them. Defending slavery wasn't just like a single policy plank.
No, not
It was the core economic necessity of their most powerful constituency. It became completely intertwined with what it meant to be a Democrat in the South. You just couldn't separate the defense of local control from the defense of slavery.
Because slavery was the engine of local wealth.
Exactly.
And this is where the party's early branding becomes so fascinating.
It's symbols.
Right. When a party is trying to unite voters across a massive geographic area, especially back then, in an era with vastly different literacy rates, they need powerful visual symbols.
And Reverend Arnold's text dives into these early symbols, and they aren't the ones we immediately recognize today. Like the text brings up a historical marker for the Democratic Party rooster.
Yes, the rooster.
I had absolutely no idea about this. Apparently, this originated in Greenfield, Indiana during the 1840 campaign.
The rooster is a great example of early political marketing. In 1840, the political landscape was shifting toward mass participation. Campaigns were becoming these rowdy, highly visual events.
Like big parades and stuff.
Exactly. And the rooster was adopted as a symbol of agrarian wakefulness, pride, combativeness. It was a way for local Democrats, particularly in rural areas like Indiana, to signal their allegiance to those agrarian working man roots against the perceived elitism of their political opponents.
But the rooster eventually gets overshadowed by the symbol we all know today, which is the donkey.
Yes, the famous donkey.
And the origin story provided in the source material for the donkey it's incredibly aggressive. It's not the cute, steadfast mascot you see on bumper stickers today.
No, it started as a massive insult.
The text analyzes a political cartoon by Thomas Nast from January 15, 1870, and the visual is stark. It depicts a live jackass kicking a dead lion.
Thomas Nast was a fiercely partisan cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, and he was actually a staunch Republican.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he used the donkey to insult the Democratic Party. In that specific 1870 cartoon, the live jackass represented a specific faction known as the Copperheads.
No, hold on. Let me stop you right there. For the listener who might not be deep into Civil War factions, who were the Copperheads?
Copperheads was a derogatory term used to describe a faction of Northern Democrats during the Civil War.
Okay.
These were Democrats living in the Union who strongly opposed the war. They wanted an immediate peace settlement with the Confederacy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They argued that the war was unconstitutional and that trying to force the South back into the Union, especially if it meant emancipating enslaved people, was a violation of those original states' rights principles.
Okay, so the jackass represents these anti-war Northern Democrats. And who is the dead lion they're kicking in Nast's cartoon?
The dead lion represented Edwin M. Stanton.
Who was he?
He had been Abraham Lincoln's fiercely loyal Secretary of War, and Stanton had recently died. So Nast's cartoon was essentially saying, look at these cowardly, anti-war Copperhead Democrats, disrespecting the legacy of a great deceased Union leader.
Man, that is a profound insult.
He meant it as a massive insult. He was calling them stubborn, foolish, disrespectful. But over time, the Democratic Party actually reclaimed the donkey symbol, spinning it to represent steadfastness and being an advocate for the common man.
That brings up a fascinating structural problem for the party, though. You just mentioned the Copperheads were Northern Democrats.
Right.
So by the time we get to the mid-1800s, this massive agrarian coalition is starting to crack. If you have Northern Democrats who just want peace and Southern Democrats who are literally willing to tear the country apart to protect slavery, how does the party hold together?
It barely does. We are entering the antebellum divide right before the Civil War.
It's a period of intense, desperate political maneuvering, right?
Absolutely. The fierce protection of local agrarian economies inevitably clashed with growing moral movements in the North, and the party found itself fracturing along geographic lines.
All right.
You had Northern Democrats who were facing immense pressure from abolitionists in their home states. They couldn't just overtly defend slavery without losing their local elections.
But then you had the Southern Democrats who were absolute hardliners.
Exactly. They demanded that the federal government actively protect the expansion of slavery into new Western territories.
The text highlights Stephen A. Douglas as a prime example of this impossible tightrope walk. He was a very prominent Northern Democrat, and he tried to pitch a compromise called popular sovereignty.
Yes, popular sovereignty. Douglas's idea was essentially an attempt to kick the can down the road.
How so?
Well, he argued that instead of the federal government deciding whether a new territory would allow slavery, they should just let the local settlers vote on it themselves.
Appealing to that Jeffersonian local control again.
Exactly. He thought he could say to the North, look, it's democratic, and say to the South, look, the federal government isn't banning it.
But the hardliners in the South didn't buy it. For them, leaving the fate of slavery up to a local vote wasn't good enough. They viewed slavery as a constitutional right of property, and they wanted federal guarantees.
Right. They wanted it codified.
So while the Democrats are essentially tearing themselves apart in the Civil War over how vigorously to defend slavery, a new political force emerges to capitalize on the chaos.
Yes, the Republican Party. And Reverend Arnold's text makes a very clear contrast here for students of political science.
Right. How do the Republicans differ?
The Republican Party was founded in the 1850s explicitly on an anti-slavery platform. Their primary unifying goal was to stop the expansion of slavery into the Western territories.
So as we approach the election of 1860, how is the Democratic Party communicating with voters? Because they are deeply divided, but they still want to win elections, obviously. The text points to historical party flyers from this era, and they are, honestly, psychological masterpieces of fear-mongering.
They really are. The visual tactics were entirely focused on targeting voter fears of massive social upheaval. The Democratic messaging aimed to convince white voters, especially in the North and border states, that a Republican victory would mean the end of the American way of life.
There's one specific flyer mentioned in the source material that perfectly illustrates this. It literally pits two visual scenarios against each other.
Yes, the 1860 flyer.
One side is labeled Union and Liberty, and it features Abraham Lincoln shaking hands with a white laborer. The other side is labeled Union and Slavery, and it shows a Democrat shaking hands with Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, over an auction block of enslaved people.
It's extremely stark imagery.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how visual psychological manipulation like this was supposed to keep a divided party afloat.
It worked by playing on the deepest anxieties of the white electorate. Democratic leaders used this imagery to frame the Republican platform of abolition, not as a moral imperative, but as a direct threat to the economic stability and constitutional order of the nation.
Right.
They told Northern working-class voters, if the Republicans emancipate the slaves, millions of freedmen will move north and take your jobs.
Wow.
And they told Southern voters, the Republicans are going to destroy your entire economy and spark slave rebellions.
So by utilizing that visceral fear of integration and economic collapse, they managed to hold a fragile, fractured coalition together just long enough to fight the election.
Just long enough, yes. But fear-mongering only works until the reality of war actually hits.
Right. Lincoln wins in 1860, the South secedes, the Civil War breaks out, and that fragile Democratic coalition shatters completely. The Southern wing rallies around the Confederacy, and the Northern wing is split between supporting the Union war effort and demanding peace.
The Copperheads again.
Right. Which brings us to the aftermath. In 1865, the Union wins. Slavery is abolished by the 13th Amendment. The entire socioeconomic foundation of the Southern Democratic Party is outlawed.
It's gone.
So how does a political party survive when its core identity is rendered illegal?
They survived by adapting their resistance. We enter the Reconstruction era, roughly 1865 to 1877.
Okay.
This was the period when the Republican-led federal government attempted to rebuild the South and integrate millions of freed African Americans into the civic life of the nation.
Right.
They pushed through the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment granting citizenship, and the 15th Amendment securing voting rights for black men.
And this brings us back to that shocking piece of data we opened with, the legislative impact of the 14th Amendment in 1868. When the vote came to the floor of Congress, it received 94% support from Republicans.
Zero.
And 0 support from Democrats.
Zero.
Not a single voting Democrat in the House or the Senate supported granting citizenship and equal rights to freed slaves.
That statistic is a perfect distillation of the party's ideological stance during Reconstruction. They viewed these federal amendments as an extreme, tyrannical overreach of federal power.
Because it disrupted their local order.
Exactly. In their view, the federal government was destroying the traditional Southern social order and punishing the defeated white South. They were ideologically incapable of supporting a measure that elevated their former property to the status of political equals.
But the resistance wasn't confined to the halls of Congress. I mean, when you have a party that is entirely locked out of federal power and their local political dominance is threatened by millions of newly enfranchised black voters, the resistance inevitably moves into the streets.
Yes.
And this is where Reverend Arnold's text addresses the historical link between the Democratic Party and the birth of the Ku Klux Klan.
This is a vital and honestly deeply disturbing historical connection. The source text is careful to make a distinction here, though.
Right. What's the distinction?
The Democratic Party, as an official national institution, did not pass a resolution founding the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
However, the Klan was overwhelmingly composed of white Southern Democrats. In many local regions throughout the South, the membership of the local Democratic Party apparatus and the local Klan chapter were virtually indistinguishable.
So we shouldn't think of it like the DNC forming a militant wing in a boardroom. It's more like a violent, unofficial shadow militia that emerges organically among the local party base.
Precisely.
Because if you are a Southern Democratic politician in 1868 and you are trying to win an election in a district where newly freed African Americans now outnumber white voters, you have a massive demographic problem. How do you win an election when you are mathematically outnumbered by people who are voting for the Republican Party?
You artificially depress the opposition's vote.
Yeah.
And you do it through absolute terror.
Wow.
The Klan effectively functioned as a terrorist wing serving the political goals of the Southern Democratic agenda. Their primary objective was to restore white supremacy and severely weaken the Republican-led federal government's influence in the South.
What did that actually look like on the ground for the average voter? How did extrajudicial violence translate into election victories?
The mechanism was brutally straightforward. The Klan would riot at night, targeting African-American community leaders, teachers, ministers, and any white Republicans who attempted to organize the newly enfranchised voters.
Terrorizing them.
Yes. They used intimidation, arson, beatings, and lynching to send a clear message. If you attempt to exercise your constitutional right to vote, you risk your life.
That is horrifying.
This psychological warfare and physical violence successfully suppressed black voter registration. And with the Republican vote artificially depressed through terror, Southern Democrats were able to redeem their states.
Redeem, right?
Yes. They recaptured local political dominance, took back control of state legislatures, and immediately began passing what were known as the Black Codes.
I want to clarify the Black Codes for the listener really quick. These were essentially local laws designed to act as a loophole to the 13th Amendment, right?
Exactly. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as a punishment for crime.
Oh, that loophole.
Right. The Black Codes were a network of hyper-specific localized laws targeting African Americans. They criminalized vagrancy, which essentially meant if a black man couldn't prove he was employed by a white landowner, he could be arrested, heavily fined, and then his labor would be leased out to a plantation owner to pay off the fine.
It's just slavery by another name.
It was a legal mechanism to force African Americans back into a labor economy based on debt and subservience, completely circumventing their newly won freedoms.
And while federal troops were stationed in the South during Reconstruction, there was at least some pushback against this violence, right? Like, the federal government passed the Enforcement Acts to try and crush the Klan.
They did, yes.
But in 1877, as part of a massive political compromise to settle a disputed presidential election, the federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction ends. And once those troops leave, the violent voter suppression doesn't just disappear, it morphs.
It becomes formalized.
Right. We move into the Jim Crow era.
The withdrawal of federal troops removed the only tangible protection African Americans had in the South. This allowed the Democratic Party to execute a strategic long-term maneuver. They took the terror tactics of the Klan and translated them into state law, institutionalizing racial segregation under the banner of home rule.
There's that concept again, home rule.
Yeah.
It's the direct descendant of the anti-federalist states' rights argument. They used the philosophy of local governance to justify a devastatingly oppressive system.
Exactly.
They implemented poll taxes poor black farmers couldn't afford. They implemented incredibly convoluted literacy tests, which white registrars would grade selectively. They established the doctrine of separate but equal.
And the visual propaganda they used to sell this system to the white public is incredibly revealing. Reverend Arnold's text provides a specific campaign poster from the 1884 election to illustrate how messaging evolved.
Or the John Bull poster.
Yes. The poster reads, "The Democratic Party, John Bull, and all other foreigners for free trade vs. The Republican Party and Uncle Jonathan for protection to American industries." And at the very bottom, it features the stark phrase, "War for bread."
Okay, let's break this poster down because there is a lot of 19th century political coding here. For the listener who isn't a history buff, who on earth is John Bull and what does he have to do with American segregation?
John Bull is essentially the British equivalent of Uncle Sam.
Okay.
He was the personification of Great Britain in political cartoons, usually depicted as a stout, middle-aged country gentleman. In the context of the 1880s, the Democratic Party generally favored lower tariffs and free trade, particularly for agricultural exports, whereas the Republicans favored high protective tariffs to support northern manufacturing.
But this poster is a fascinating piece of misdirection.
It really is.
Because the Republicans are framing the Democrats by linking them to John Bull and all other foreigners. But how does this relate back to the Democratic strategy during Jim Crow?
It operates in a broader ecosystem of campaign materials that manipulated public opinion by linking economic anxiety with xenophobia and racism.
Ah, I see.
During the Jim Crow era, Democratic political flyers and cartoons regularly reinforced segregationist messaging by targeting the very real economic fears of the white working class. They framed any form of integration or political equality as a threat to white jobs, a literal war for bread.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the psychology of political propaganda gets so insidious. These graphic symbols and campaign posters weren't just standard political ads saying, vote for my policies.
No, they were much deeper than that.
They were deep psychological tools engineered to unite white voters across massive class divides. Because think about it, you have a destitute white sharecropper and a wealthy white plantation owner. Economically, they have absolutely nothing in common. Their interests are actually opposed.
Very opposed to.
If they voted strictly on economics, the poor white farmer might actually align with the poor black farmer.
Which is exactly what the Southern Democratic leadership was terrified of. There was briefly a populist movement in the 1890s where poor white and black farmers did attempt to form a political alliance.
Oh, really?
Yes. But the Democratic establishment crushed it by weaponizing racial propaganda. They utilized these symbols and flyers to convince the poor white voter that their most important identity wasn't their class, but their race. They justified the Jim Crow laws as an absolute necessity for maintaining social order.
They basically said, you might be dirt poor, but at least you aren't at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and if you let the Republicans or the populists integrate this state, you will lose what little status you have.
Precisely. By framing African American advancement as an existential economic and social threat to the white working class, the Democratic leaders completely overrode the constitutional rights of African Americans. And it worked.
Wow.
They successfully turned the American South into a one-party stronghold, the Solid South, for nearly a century.
So we have this localized social order totally locked down in the southern states. But as we cross into the early 20th century, this isn't just a regional issue anymore.
Not at all.
The source material shows how this segregationist ideology eventually found its way to the highest levels of federal power. The text profiles specific politicians who carried this platform to Washington, D.C., starting with President Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson represents a profound paradox that often confuses students of history. In many textbooks, Wilson is lauded as a great progressive reformer. He championed antitrust laws, the Federal Reserve, internationalism with the League of Nations. He was a highly educated intellectual, a former president of Princeton University.
I was always taught Wilson was like the architect of modern progressive governance. So how does a progressive intellectual fit into this legacy of segregation?
Because his progressivism was entirely economic and administrative, while his social views were deeply rooted in his Southern upbringing. Wilson was born in Virginia and raised in Georgia and South Carolina during the Civil War and Reconstruction. When he became president in 1913, he brought those Southern democratic sensibilities directly into the Oval Office.
Right.
One of his most consequential actions was overseeing the segregation of the federal government workforce.
Wait, the federal workforce wasn't segregated before Wilson?
No, actually. Since the end of the Civil War, the federal civil service places like the Post Office and the Treasury Department had been one of the few avenues where African Americans could secure stable, middle-class employment, often working alongside white clerks.
Wow, I didn't know that.
But under Wilson, cabinet members were allowed to segregate offices, restrooms, and cafeterias. Many black civil servants were demoted or fired.
That is a staggering shift. He basically took the Jim Crow ideologies that had been localized in the South, that home rule concept, and gave them the ultimate federal legitimacy. He signaled from the White House that the national government endorsed a racial hierarchy.
It was a devastating blow to civil rights, and this legacy of federal segregationist power within the party continued for decades. Reverend Arnold's text contrasts early figures like Wilson with later mid-century politicians like Senator James Eastland of Mississippi.
Oh, James Eastland.
Yes, Eastland served in the Senate for decades, well into the 1970s. He used his immense power as the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee to aggressively oppose and block civil rights legislation, openly championing the vision of a segregated society right from the floor of the United States Senate.
So you have the politicians in suits institutionalizing this in Washington. But the text doesn't let us forget about the extremism operating at the grassroots level. It details the terrifying peak of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s.
The 1920s resurgence, yeah.
And the images provided in the source material are chilling. We aren't talking about a few dozen men hiding in the woods at night. We're talking about thousands of Klan members marching unmasked in broad daylight down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., right in front of the Capitol building.
The 1920s Klan resurgence is deeply disturbing, primarily because of its sheer scale and, frankly, its public normalization.
Yeah.
By the mid-1920s, the Klan claimed millions of members nationwide. They presented themselves not as a fringe terrorist cell, but as a mainstream, patriotic, fraternal organization.
And this is where I want to push back on a huge geographical assumption that I think a lot of us make. It is so easy to think of the Klan as purely a Southern, rural, backwoods phenomena.
Very common misconception.
But looking at the text, the Klan in the 1920s had immense political power in states far beyond the South. We're talking about places like Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon.
Yes.
How on earth did an organization born out of Southern resentment over the Civil War successfully infiltrate northern and western urban centers?
It's a brilliant question, and it highlights the terrifying adaptability of hate movements. In the 1920s, the Klan fundamentally broadened its platform to exploit the massive social anxieties of the post-World War I era.
What were those anxieties?
Several colliding factors. You had the Great Migration, where millions of Black Americans were moving from the rural South to northern industrial cities to escape Jim Crow and find factory work.
Right.
At the same time, you had a massive influx of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, many of whom were Catholic or Jewish. And you had the rapid urbanization of the country, with rural Americans feeling culturally left behind by the Roaring '20s happening in the cities.
So the Klan acts like a political chameleon. In the South, they still focus on anti-Black white supremacy. But when they go to Indiana or Oregon, what is their sales pitch?
In the North and West, they aggressively marketed themselves through nativism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigrant fears.
Wow.
They presented themselves as the ultimate defenders of traditional Protestant Americanism. They argued that local jobs and local culture were being stolen by immigrants and Catholics who were loyal to the Pope rather than the Constitution.
That's insidious.
And because they represented such a massive, organized voting bloc, many local Democratic and Republican politicians in these regions either actively courted Klan support or completely turned a blind eye to their activities. The Klan essentially functioned as a hyper-conservative political machine in these states.
Okay, so by the end of the 1920s, the Democratic Party is deeply structurally entangled with segregationists in the South and in many areas influenced by the nativist power of the Klan.
Yes, very fractured but entangled.
But then, the timeline hits 1929. The stock market crashes. The Great Depression triggers an unprecedented economic collapse, and this disaster forces a massive political pivot that creates the most contradictory political alliance in American history. We enter the era of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal.
The Great Depression created a crisis so severe that the old Jeffersonian arguments for a weak federal government simply couldn't hold up.
People needed help.
Exactly. The economy required an unprecedented federal response. FDR's New Deal was a massive, sweeping suite of public works programs, financial reforms, labor regulations, and social safety nets. But to pass this transformative legislation, FDR had to assemble a new coalition.
I try to picture the New Deal Democratic Party as a massive corporate merger between two completely rival companies.
That's a good analogy.
Like the CEO, FDR, is trying to hold this new conglomerate together. On one side of the boardroom, you have the Northern branch. Progressive reformers, labor union leaders, intellectuals, and increasingly working-class ethnic voters and African Americans in northern urban centers who have been devastated by the Depression and need federal relief.
Right.
On the other side of the boardroom, you have the powerful Southern branch, the traditional, deeply entrenched segregationist Southern Democrats. And because the South is a one-party region, these Southern Democrats have immense seniority in Congress. They control all the vital committees.
They have veto over everything, basically.
Right. FDR cannot pass a single piece of New Deal legislation without their approval. So how does this CEO keep the Southern branch from quitting the merger?
He keeps them by making extreme and often devastating compromises. And those compromises were almost entirely made at the expense of African Americans.
How so?
FDR knew the Southern wing would block any economic relief if they believed it would dismantle Jim Crow or disrupt their cheap agricultural labor force. So the mechanism of compromise was localized administration.
Walk me through how that actually worked in practice.
Let's look at agricultural subsidies or public works programs. The federal government would allocate the funds, but FDR allowed the actual distribution of those funds and the management of those programs to be controlled by local, state-level boards.
And in the South?
In the South, these boards were entirely controlled by white segregationists. So while a white farmer might receive federal subsidies to save his farm, a black sharecropper in the same county would be systematically denied those same benefits. And when creating Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act, domestic and agricultural workers were explicitly excluded from the protections.
And who made up the vast majority of domestic and agricultural workers in the South? African American.
Exactly. It was a surgical carve-out designed specifically to maintain the Southern racial hierarchy while still allowing the broader economic legislation to pass. FDR avoided supporting federal anti-lynching legislation because he openly admitted he could not risk alienating the Southern committee chairs.
So he kept the corporate merger alive by essentially allowing the Southern branch to completely violate the overarching ethical code of the New Deal just to secure their votes on economic policy.
Yes, and if you connect this to the bigger picture, this New Deal era is the vital bridge where the Democratic Party begins to fracture ideologically.
Economically versus socially.
Yeah. Right. Economically, they were completely abandoning their anti-federalist roots. They were becoming the party of massive federal intervention and social safety nets. But socially, in the South, they remained the party of white supremacy and home rule. It was a coalition built on a massive tectonic fault line. The pressure was building underneath the surface for decades.
And that fault line finally, explosively ruptured in the 1960s.
It did.
The pressure from the grassroots civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., the NAACP, and thousands of organizers, became too immense to ignore. The moral imperative of the era forced the Democratic Party to finally choose between its old Southern segregationist base and its new identity as a vehicle for progressive reform. We have reached the Great Realignment.
The transformation from a pro-slavery party to a civil rights advocate reaches its climax under the leadership of John F. Kennedy and, most notably, Lyndon B. Johnson. The televised brutality of the Jim Crow South Dogs attacking protesters in Birmingham, the bombing of churches, the violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, horrified the nation and the world. The Democratic establishment realized that the New Deal compromise could no longer hold.
And this brings us to the crucial storytelling data of this entire deep dive. The legislative impact of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This is the moment the identity of the ship is officially rewritten.
Yes, the turning point.
Let's look at the voting numbers Reverend Arnold provides in the text. In the House of Representatives, 152 Democrats voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act. That was about 61% of the party's House members. In the Senate, 46 Democrats voted for it, which was about 69% of their Senate caucus.
On the surface, that looks like a solid majority.
Yeah, it does.
But you have to look at who was voting against it. The bill was fiercely opposed by a record-breaking, multi-month filibuster in the Senate, and that filibuster was led entirely by Southern Democrats.
The very people who had formed the geographical bedrock of the party since 1828 were fighting tooth and nail against a Democratic president, LBJ, who was using all of his political capital to champion the bill.
The internal war within the party was absolute. It is incredible to compare the leaders we discussed earlier, segregationists like Woodrow Wilson and James Eastland, to this new era of civil rights advocates operating under the exact same party banner.
But here's the statistical paradox that often confuses people today.
Okay.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act ultimately passed with significant bipartisan support, and in fact, a higher percentage of Republicans in Congress voted for the act than Democrats. Why was that?
This raises an important question, and it comes back to geography.
Geography.
The Republican Party in 1964 had very few elected representatives in the Deep South. Their base was primarily in the North and the West, where supporting civil rights was much more politically viable and aligned with the historical roots of the party of Lincoln.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
The Democratic Party, on the other hand, was dragging the anchor of its massive Southern segregationist wing. So while Northern Democrats overwhelmingly supported the bill, the Southern Democrats voted against it as a bloc, dragging down the party's overall percentage.
So LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act. The federal government uses its immense power to effectively outlaw Jim Crow segregation. What is the immediate fallout of a party fundamentally redefining its core identity and actively legislating against its oldest, most loyal constituency?
The immediate fallout was the total alienation of white Southern voters.
They must have felt totally abandoned.
They felt profoundly betrayed. For over a century, the Democratic Party had promised to protect their local home rule from federal interference. And now, a Democratic president had used federal power to dismantle their social order.
And they didn't just accept it, they left.
They did.
They initiated a massive political realignment that would reshape the electoral map for the next 60 years. And the source text points out that this migration of Southern white voters was famously catalyzed by the 1964 Republican presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater.
Yes, Goldwater. He was a conservative Republican who voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He didn't argue against it on explicitly racial grounds. Rather, he argued against it on constitutional grounds, claiming it was an overreach of federal power into private business and states' rights.
States' rights, the exact same philosophical language the anti-federalist and the pro-slavery Democrats had used a century earlier.
Exactly, and that language resonated deeply with the alienated white Southern voters. Goldwater lost the 1964 election in a landslide to LBJ, but he won 5 states in the Deep South states that hadn't voted for a Republican since Reconstruction.
The crack in the dam.
It was. Over the following decades, the Republican Party employed the Southern strategy to actively court these disaffected conservative voters, leading to a near-total flip in the political geography of the country. The Democrats traded their historic geographic stronghold in the South for a new identity as the party of federal civil rights enforcement.
It is a total, complete inversion of where they started in 1828. From existing to defend local agrarian slavery against federal overreach, to utilizing the full might of the federal government to dismantle local segregation.
A profound shift.
Which brings us to the final section of Reverend Arnold's text. Looking back at this massive 2-century arc, we have to ask a foundational question. Why did he write this book? Why is it so critical for him to document this specific, often painful history today, rather than just letting it remain in the past?
Well, the author, Reverend Dr. Antonio Arnold, approaches this history not merely as a political scientist, but profoundly from his background as a Christian theologian and pastor.
Yeah.
His faith deeply informs his methodology. He is very transparent about his personal motivations in the text. He views the act of documenting these historical ties between the Democratic Party, the institution of slavery, and the Ku Klux Klan as a necessary act of moral and spiritual reflection.
So he's not just listing dates and facts. He is framing this historical analysis through the theological concepts of repentance and accountability.
Yes.
He argues that in both faith and in civics, you cannot heal a deep wound without first fully examining how deep the infection goes, who caused it, and what systems allowed it to fester.
From his perspective, a political party, much like an individual, must confront the sins of its past to genuinely move forward. He believes that understanding this history is vital because the legacy of these past alignments, the era of Jim Crow, the complicity with systemic violence, the weaponization of visual propaganda, doesn't just evaporate when a new law is passed.
Trauma lingers.
The cultural and political shockwaves of those eras continue to influence modern political discourse, voting patterns, and the ongoing struggle for equity today.
And for students who are researching American political evolution, Reverend Arnold's text provides incredibly clear, actionable takeaways. First, it demonstrates definitively that political alignments are not static. Party identities are incredibly fluid. They are responsive to immense social pressures, economic crises, and grassroots moral movements.
They absolutely are.
Second, it proves that the specific language of political arguments like states' rights or local control can be utilized by vastly different groups across different centuries to achieve wildly different outcomes.
It teaches students to look beyond the immediate rhetoric of whatever election cycle we are currently in and to understand the long, deep historical currents that actually shape the platforms we vote on today.
And I want to turn this directly to you, the listener. When you reflect on this massive historical arc we've just traversed, how does understanding this deep, often contradictory complexity inform your own understanding of modern voter behavior?
It's a great question to ask.
When you see a voter today who is fiercely, unbreakably loyal to a specific political brand, do you consider the centuries of ideological shifts, the intense internal compromises, and the massive realignments that actively built that modern loyalty?
It certainly encourages a much more critical, nuanced view of politics. It reminds us that the establishment of today was often the radical rebellion of yesterday, and vice versa.
So let's summarize the incredible narrative arc we've unpacked today from Reverend Arnold's book. We trace the Democratic Party from its birth in the agrarian anti-federalist roots of the late 1700s, where its defense of local control inextricably linked it to fiercely protecting the institution of slavery.
Right.
We saw how the trauma of the Civil War shattered that base, leading the southern wing of the party to utilize the terror of the Ku Klux Klan to violently suppress black voters during Reconstruction.
The Jim Crow era.
Exactly. We watched as that violent suppression was formalized into the Jim Crow laws, utilizing xenophobic, psychological campaign propaganda to unite white voters. We followed the timeline as the party navigated the massive contradictions of the New Deal, attempting to balance economic progressivism with horrific racial conservatism.
And then the breaking point.
Right. Finally, we saw the pressure of the civil rights movement force the party to fracture in the 1960s, shedding its oldest segregationist base to champion the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
A truly staggering 200-year transformation.
Which leaves us with a profound thought to mull over as we wrap up. If a major political party can completely invert its foundational ideologies over the course of a century, literally trading the defense of states' rights to own slaves for the use of federal power to enforce civil rights, what core, seemingly unshakable, non-negotiable beliefs of today's political parties might be entirely unrecognizable to voters 100 years from now?
It really makes you wonder what future historians will look back on as our era's great realignment.
It absolutely does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.